For over 20 years I have been watching Detective Conan, and this year I finally caught up to all episodes. So I decided to rate every single episode from 0 to 5. I'll cover 50 episodes per video and will group together multi-part episodes unless it just happens that they are split up due to my 50 episode per video rule. I'll also mark if the episodes are filler or not, so let's begin. Episode 1. The Roller Coaster Murder Case. It's where it all begins. A murder happens and Shinichi solves it, due to seeing through the killer's illusion. We then get introduced to two other important characters, Ran Mori, Shinichi's childhood friend and love interest, and her father, Kogoro Mori, who is a detective, but not a very successful one. While Shinichi and Ran go to an amusement park, they get involved in a murder case, and it's one of the most gruesome ones in the entire series. It once again isn't a straightforward case due to a trick that the culprit used, but Shinichi is not fooled and solves it. He, however, takes interest in two very suspicious men at the murder scene and decides to follow them, which ends up being a big mistake for him, but at the same time, it's the essence of the whole series. He is forced to swallow a pill containing a poison and is left to die. However, the poison doesn't do that and instead turns him into a kid. What can I say? It's the episode that started it all. Many things happen in it, hence why I talk so much about it, but it's interesting from start to finish. My only complaint is that it contains the accidental pervert trope, which has been done to death, but that alone doesn't sour the experience. It's a 5 out of 5. The second episode starts where the first one ends, with shrunken Shinichi being found by the police. He at first doesn't realize what is happening and runs away from the police, only to shortly after that discover why everything is so weird. Confused and without any plan on what to do, he runs to his house, where he meets Professor Agasa, who is a family friend, and he tells him what happened. Ran also shows up since she is searching for Shinichi, and when she asks the boy what's his name, he improvises and names himself Conan Edogawa, a supposed relative of Professor Agasa. Agasa then suggests that Ran takes the boy to her place since her father is a detective, and this way Shinichi might find out who the men in black are. Later, during a conversation with Conan, Ran admits that she loves Shinichi, and at this point, Conan nearly reveals who he really is, but Kogoro interrupts them and they go to the scene of a kidnapping case. There, Shinichi of course tries to help, although as a kid, it is quite hard. He does however find out where the missing girl is located, and he nearly gets killed due to being reckless once again. Thankfully, Ran's karate skills save the day. Again, an episode where it all begins, and it's again a 5 out of 5 from me. In the third episode, Conan is befriended by three kids from school, Ayumi, Genta and Mitsuhiko. They all notice that he is different from the other kids and try to learn more about him, hence why they follow him. Meanwhile, Kogoro's client is his idol, singer Yoko Okino, who reports that someone has been breaking into her apartment. Kogoro and his family go take a look, and to the horror of everyone, they discover a corpse in the apartment. There are three murder suspects: Yoko, her manager, and Yoko's jealous rival Yuko. However, nothing really makes sense, and every new detail we get from the suspects further complicates things. Conan, however, solves the mystery, and the truth is something no one expected. In this episode, we also have the debut of Conan's iconic gadget, the bow tie, which can change his voice so he can imitate everyone. My main complaint about this episode is the animation, which at times is really subpar, but that alone doesn't hurt the episode. I still give it a 5 out of 5, and don't worry, the streak will end soon. The first 3 episodes were the most essential episodes in the series since they established the setting and the concept of the series, and they were really executed flawlessly. So let's continue. Episode 4 is about Conan and the detective boys coming across a paper with a coded message, and the kids assume that this paper will lead them to a treasure. Conan doubts that, but he's always up for solving a mystery. Little does he know that said paper belongs to a bunch of suspicious men who start following the kids. It is a somehow silly episode, but it's fun, so I'll give it a 4. In episode 5, Conan is with Ron, Kogoro, and the detective boys on a train and notices 2 men in black, who he assumes are the same 2 men who poisoned him. So he uses a miniature microphone to listen to their conversation. It turns out that those 2 men just look like gin and vodka. But they are also up to no good. In fact, they gave a person they met on the train a briefcase with a bomb, and it's now up to Conan to find out who has the briefcase and to prevent the whole train from exploding. I'll give this episode a 4. Episode 6 is the first filler episode of the series, and boy will there be a lot of them in the future. This episode is also rather underwhelming. Conan gets jealous because a muscular guy is flirting with Ron. He follows them and then a murder happens, which is so poorly thought through that it hurts. The episode had its funny moments, but it's really skippable and I'll just give it a 2 out of 5. Episode 7 is about a strange case where a man is receiving gifts and money from an unknown person and he goes to Kogoro to find out who is behind this. At the same time, Ron is finally starting to suspect Conan. He's no ordinary kid, and she even thinks that he might be actually Shinichi. Will Conan solve the case and trick Ron at the same time? Well, considering the series is now over 1140 episodes long, you can kind of answer the latter part. Overall, it's an excellent episode that sadly is graced with horrid character design, like it's the case with almost every episode where the animation director is Ogawara. I don't know why this is his style, but every single character looks like a steamroller just went over them. The episode still gets a 5, but Ogawara, why couldn't you do this to a filler episode? In the 8th episode, our trio visits the museum and a grisly murder happens there, which on top of all is also filmed by the security camera. But there's more to this, since the culprit did this intentionally. Overall, it's a great case and a great episode, and the animation is good again, so this episode also gets a 5 from me. In the 9th episode, we get a murder case that was planned for a while, with the killer using a simple trick to fool the police into thinking that he has an alibi. Conan of course doesn't fall for it. It's an enjoyable case, but it's somewhat weaker than most other cases at the start of the series, so I'll give it a 3. In the 10th episode, a girl shows up at a detective agency claiming that she is the girlfriend of Shinichi, and she reports him as missing in hopes that Kogoro would search for him. Kogoro dismisses her, but Ron is of course eager to find out what's her connection to Shinichi. Overall, it's an entertaining episode that gets a 4 from me. Episode 11 is a special and is double the length of your typical episode. It's also one of the most iconic cases. Conan and the Maurice get an invitation to an island only to discover that the person who sent the letter has been dead for 10 years. Shortly after that, several murders happen, which are all tied to what happened previously on this island. Let's just say, plenty of people in this case have dark secrets. This episode is a fan favorite of many, and deservedly so. It's very memorable. And while it is not in my top 10 all favorite episode, it's still a 5 out of 5. In the 12th episode, Conan is playing hide and seek with his friends, which of course bores him. Meanwhile, Ayumi is worried since right now there has been a murder series where little girls get kidnapped and killed. Well, this wouldn't be Detective Conan if Ayumi wouldn't be accidentally kidnapped when she hid in the trunk of the car and fell asleep. When she awakes, she finds lots of money next to her and something that would definitely scar everyone for life. It's up to Conan to rescue Ayumi before the drivers of the car find her. What happens in the end would be a massive spoiler, so watch the episode for yourself. Overall, it's a 4 out of 5 for me. Episode number 13. It's indeed an unlucky number. Ironically, this is one of the rare times the anime completely messed up, because at the start of the series they really didn't pay that much attention to being accurate with the manga, changed a few things, and with this episode it really bit them in the ass later. Yes, at the start they thought that this won't be a long series. This is also the reason why this episode gets redone over 100 episodes later so that it has an ending that doesn't contradict the whole series. The set episode 13 is still quite enjoyable, it's quite humorous, and not gonna lie, I kind of miss the fast-paced plots and jokes that the first episodes had. It's a 4 out of 5 for me. In the 14th episode, Conan discovers evidence that someone used a sniper, and that said person is being forced to use it. So with the help of the police, Conan needs to prevent an assassination. While this sounds interesting, the episode is really rather weak, and I'll give it a 1. In the 15th episode, the kids start their own detective business in school, and their first client wants them to search for his missing cat. They do eventually find it, but the cat is full of blood. They realize that the feline isn't injured, so the blood must be from someone else. They look through the window where the cat came from and discover a corpse. So they call the police, but when the police come, the dead man is nowhere to be found. It's up to Conan to solve the mystery, and all I will say is that the culprit in this case is definitely insane, which isn't the case most of the time in this series, but this guy here is ripe for the madhouse. Overall, the episode gets a 5 from me. Episode 16 is about Kogoro and Ko going to a client who then gets visited by 3 people, and during this time he gets murdered. But not before a dying message is left, which the culprit tries to mask, but not well enough for Conan to not notice. Overall, it's a 4 out of 5 for me. The 17th episode is ideal if you're nostalgic about Home Alone, because this episode is then perfect for you. The kids end up locked in a department store only to discover that the store is getting robbed. This results in a cat and mouse game with the robbers, and it's done in a very over-the-top comedic way, to the point that it really contradicts most of the other Detective Conan episodes, but it is really similar to Home Alone. Overall, for me, it's a bit too much since it doesn't really fit with the rest of the series, so I'll give it a 2. In episode 18, Ron and Sonoko's former teacher is getting married and they come to the wedding, but that gets interrupted when the bride collapses because somebody poisoned her drink. Will she survive? Who poisoned her? And most importantly, why? Well, it's complicated, and explaining this would really spoil the whole episode, so I will just give it a 4, and it's up to you if you watch the episode. The 19th episode does something differently. It implies who the culprit is as soon as the episode starts, and that's all of the innovation we'll get from this rather typical Conan episode. It's kind of a middle of the road filler. Ron meets up with a famous fashion designer as a potential model, and in the meantime the secretary of said designer gets murdered. Conan instantly suspects her since the case is really rather simple and the killer made a lot of mistakes, like carrying the evidence in her purse. Overall, it's a 2 for me. Episode 20 has Conan and the detective boys investigate a supposedly abandoned house that is rumored to be haunted. The truth, however, is far more terrifying, since we get to see what extremes people go to make sure that a dark secret remains hidden. I'll give this episode a 5. In episode 21, Kogoro and Ko get invited to a film set by Yoko Okino, but problems quickly arise since one person there is causing severe tension with everyone. As you might predict, he soon kicks the bucket, but things don't add up since the evidence is conflicting because several people mess with the murder scene to project the blame onto someone else. Overall, it's an enjoyable episode except for one thing. Ogawara was once again the animation director and everybody looks like they had plastic surgery that went wrong. Annoying, but you cannot change that. The episode gets a 3 out of 5 from me. Episodes 22 and 23 are a 2-part case where Conan and the Maurice end up on a private ship due to missing theirs. There they meet a family where nearly everyone acts weird and tensions are high, so to no surprise soon someone gets murdered. And shortly after that, somebody else bites the dust. One person gets blamed for the murders, but Conan doubts that the case is this simple. Overall, it's an excellent and complex case that gets a 5 from me. Episode 24 is about a woman suffering from amnesia, but there's something very off about her, and Conan instantly notices that she is not an ordinary person. That said, this episode is kind of weak, so I'll give it a 2. Episode 25 is a filler and a very depressing one at that, since it's about a kidnapped teenage girl and it's suspected that she might no longer be alive, since it's assumed that she and the kidnapper were in a car which drove into a river. It also doesn't help that the girl's father is as stingy and greedy as it gets, and despite being rich, it gets quite obviously implied that he cares more about his money than his child. We also learn the tragic backstory of the kidnapper, and let's just put it like this: when the girl gets rescued, she cares more about what will happen to her kidnapper than seeing her father, since that man clearly failed at his job. It's a very depressing episode, but I have a soft spot for cases like this, so I'll give it a 4. Episode 26 is about a German Shepherd that Conan has known for years. Said dog was proven to be very loyal and friendly, but then one day he attacks a young man who dies after being pushed down the stairs by the dog. Conan instantly suspects foul play and is certain that the dog was trained to perform this action, and unless he can prove this, the dog will be put down. It's a sad case, but a solid one, so I'll give it a 3. Episodes 27 and 28 are about Kogoro having a class reunion. Everything seems fine until a murder happens, and Kogoro is determined to find out which one of his friends is the culprit. Conan this time just gives him minimal help and lets Kogoro do the job by himself, which he actually pulls off. Despite what you might think, Kogoro isn't a terrible detective if he actually tries. This episode gets a 5 from me. Episode 29 is about the president of a software company with a very weak heart, and he suffers a heart attack in his sleep. Conan has doubts that this happened by itself and suspects that a heart attack was triggered. This episode is now more thought-provoking than it was in the 90s, since technology has evolved so much since, and we also have AI these days. This said, the episode is kind of weak, so it's a 1 for me. In episode 30, Kogoro meets up with a client, a respected lawyer, whose wife gets murdered while he is seemingly more or less the whole time with Kogoro and his family. This would mean that he has an alibi, but Conan has doubts about this and is certain that he used some kind of trick. It's a rather weak episode, so I'll give it just a 1. In episode 31, Kogoro is invited to a TV station known for its hit show, where a 4-minute murder happens and the audience then guesses who is the culprit. The writer of said thriller scenarios, however, has a grudge against the TV producer and decides to murder him while the 4-minute thriller is broadcasted. While he acts suspiciously, he has an alibi, since he used a trick to murder a victim several floors beneath him. Conan is of course instantly suspicious, and you can kind of guess how the rest of the episode plays out. I'll give it a 4. Episode 32 is about Conan finding out that Ron is meeting up with someone, and he gets very jealous since he suspects Ron is seeing another man. He follows her, much to Ron's annoyance. Ron decides to go to a nearby store to get Conan some cake, and in the meantime Conan waits and sees who else comes to the place, since one of those people must be Ron's date. He notices a young man talking vulgarly about a girl he plans on meeting, so he assumes that's Ron's date, and then a murder happens. So he decides to solve that first before he confronts the guy. Overall, it's a very entertaining and funny episode that gets a 5 from me. In episode 33, we have the first time that Augusta takes Conan and the detective boys on a trip. Many such cases will come in the future. Anyway, the kids are given a treasure map and they need to solve it. While the plot is rather simple, it gets executed perfectly, making this episode very enjoyable and memorable, so it's on par with the canon episodes. So I'll give it a 4 out of 5. Episodes 34 and 35 are episodes that most fans hold in high regard. This two-parter is by many considered to be the scariest episode, and for good reason. It's about Conan and Ron meeting up with Sonoko at a remote lodge in the forest. Also joining them is Sonoko's sister and her friends, but they aren't alone since a mysterious person in bandages and an axe is also there. And Ron is attacked, but manages to survive uninjured, twice. This episode soon gets very dark since it has one of the most brutal murders in the whole series. If one chooses to watch an episode of Detective Conan for Halloween, then this is one of the top candidates. Overall, I'll give this episode a 5 out of 5, of course. The next episode is about Ayumi going to a dentist, and during the procedure a real estate property boss gets killed. The dentist is the main suspect, but Ayumi's procedure gives her an alibi. Conan has doubts about this and wants to find out the truth about this case. For me personally, this case would need a little more substance, so it's just a 2 for me. In the 37th episode, we are introduced to a woman who lost everything she cherished. The people responsible got off scot-free, so she decided to take justice into her hands. Can Conan stop her? I must admit I quite like filler cases like this, which are on the depressing side, but at the same time they show depth to a single character who only appears in one episode. I'll give this episode a 4. Episode 38 is about a client who hires Kogoro to spy on a man, who then later is found dead. The man who hired Kogoro becomes the prime suspect, but he went on a trip the day before the victim was last seen by Kogoro. Both Kogoro and Conan suspect foul play, but can they prove how he committed a seemingly perfect crime? This episode gets a 4 for me. Episodes 39 and 40 are a 2-part case in which Kogoro and his family are invited to a party where a very rich young woman celebrates her birthday. She also has many suitors, and everything seems fine until most of the cars have their tires slit, with only one car being spared. The rich daughter of course refuses to sit together with other people in a cheap car, so she decides to stay at the villa, and so do her suitors, as well as Kogoro and his family. But then the rich daughter goes missing, and a corpse is found shortly after that. Turns out that the rich daughter doesn't just have a rotten personality, she also has a dark secret, and someone is out there for revenge. A great episode in my opinion, and I'll give it a 5. Episode 41 is a filler episode about a championship flag getting destroyed during a baseball match. It's just as interesting as it sounds. Honestly, this is one of the blandest episodes of the whole series. And there's just nothing memorable about it except that it is so bland and it just sticks out like a sore thumb because it is just so noticeably worse than every other episode from the first 100 or so episodes. This episode gets a 0 from me. Episode 42 is about Ron's rich friend Sonoko inviting Ron and Conan to a private meeting with a popular band. But the band members don't get along and the lead singer plans to leave the band. But he doesn't get a chance to do this. And a tragedy is followed by an even bigger tragedy, due to people not being honest with each other. This episode manages to be both heart-wrenching as well as romantic, and it gets a 5 for me. Episode 43 finally addresses Conan's past, in the sense that Kogoro and Ron begin to question where are his parents. And the timing couldn't be more perfect, since Conan's mother shows up at the detective agency to pick up her son. How is that possible, you may ask, considering that Conan is actually Shinichi? Well, you need to watch this episode, because otherwise I'd spoil everything for you. The episode gets a 5, and it's definitely worth a watch. Episode 44 starts with Kogoro and the kids driving to a client, when they come across a rich man whose car broke down. He is grateful for this and invites them to his birthday party. There his 2 sons and his daughter-in-law already await him, and an unsuspected guest also shows up. His estranged daughter, who claims she got an invite only to be told by her father he didn't invite her and doesn't want anything to do with her. The party is of course ruined, and the father goes to his room where he opens a wooden box containing an expensive wine, but said box explodes, killing him. Yes, nobody in this family is on good terms with each other, and more grudges are soon revealed. It's a decent episode, but again, Ogawara was the animation director, so everybody looks horrible. I'll give this episode a 3. Episode 45 has a case where Kogoro meets a suspect of a murder case, and that's how he and the kids end up going to a murder scene. A middle-aged woman was killed and there are 3 suspects. This was a very straightforward case, but someone messed up with the murder scene and unintentionally created an alibi for the actual culprit, complicating things in every way possible. Sometimes the truth emerges after the mask drops, or in this case, when it gets pulled off. Overall, it's an enjoyable episode, although the situation of the unintentional alibi is kind of ridiculous in hindsight. This episode gets a 3. In episode 46, Kogoro and the kids are at a ski resort, but Kogoro loses the keys to their lodge. They meet a medical professor who invites them to his lodge where he and his co-workers are staying at. Later, said professor gets murdered in what is one of the worst deaths ever in this series. And it wasn't the blood loss. His lungs were punctured, so he suffocated due to not being able to breathe. The culprit was at first assumed to be a robber, but it soon became obvious the professor was killed by one of his co-workers. I really like this episode. It's fast-paced, it gets to the point, and just does everything right, so it gets a 5 from me. Episode 47 is about a group of diving athletes, and one of them is doing overtime at being the biggest asshole imaginable. Which of course in Detective Conan means that it won't take long before he kicks the bucket. It's a very predictable filler, and honestly the evidence that is presented as proof to who the culprit is so far-fetched that it's laughable. This episode gets a 1. Episodes 49 and 48 feature a new character, Heiji Hattori, a teenage detective from Osaka who came to Tokyo to challenge Shinichi. Since for obvious reasons Shinichi is nowhere to be found, he goes to the detective agency where he meets Ran, Kogoro and Conan, who has a very bad cold, and Heiji gives him a sip of a Chinese alcohol. Yes, don't do that when you have sick kids. Don't give them alcohol. Don't give them alcohol at all. Judging by what Ran tells him, he deduces that Shinichi must be located close to her, and then a client enters the room who wants that Kogoro researches the background of her stepson's girlfriend. So everybody goes to the house of this woman to talk to her husband, only to find him dead. Both Heiji and Conan start to investigate, but Conan's condition worsens and he gets carried into the other room. Heiji deduces how the culprit committed the crime and who is the murderer, and sees this as his victory over Shinichi. But then Shinichi appears and points out that there is an oversight and uncovers what actually happened. Let's just put it like this: a plot twist happens. Heiji admits his defeat, but notices that there's something wrong with Shinichi, who then quickly hides since he can feel that he's going to turn back into Conan any second now. Somehow he manages to keep his identity a secret, and he also deduces that the only thing that could have possibly changed him back was the Chinese alcohol. This episode gets, of course, a 5. Episode 50 continues where the previous episode ended, with Conan attempting to get his hands on the Chinese alcohol, but first, since he missed school for a few days, he needs to go to the library, where several things are suspicious. An employee has been missing for a few days, the books seem weird, and indeed some are faked. And then there is the creepy librarian. Conan and the kids hide in the building, since Conan is certain that the missing person's corpse is still here. But the culprit has noticed them, and the episode quickly turns into one of the scariest episodes of the series. All things end well, and Conan gets his hands on the alcohol, only to discover that it only works as an antidote once. So instead, he gets a massive hangover. Despite this episode unfortunately having a horrid art style, it's still one of the best episodes of the series, and it gets a 5 out of 5 from me. So these are the first 50 episodes. I know I gave to a lot of episodes a 5 or a 4, but plenty of these episodes at the beginning are quite iconic. I promise my ratings for the remaining episodes will be more balanced. And trust me, there will be way more zeros than just one. Stay tuned, and if you like this video and want to support it, click the like button or comment, everything helps with the algorithm.